Small doses.
Self-help from the hip.
Small doses.
We're talking that shit.
Small doses.
And keeping it real.
Small doses.
With me and them Seals.
It's so funky.
Welcome. This is a bonus content, more to say, of Small Doses, side effects of being light-skinned. So sometimes you guys ask so many good questions that we don't get to cover them all in the show. So we come here and cover them all, or at least cover as much as we can for you all with this extra little segment that is for our Patreon only. All right. So shout out to Seal Squad for checking in with us as we continue the conversation around side effects of being light skinned. Now, we don't have Mona joining us. All you got is me, but I'm going to do my best to answer these questions as thoroughly and thoughtfully as possible because that's how you wrote them. First question. As a light skinned person, at what age did you notice colorism? Do you ever feel guilty when you benefit from it? Like seeing clearly that you reaped a benefit because your shade was more favorable to the powers that be? I would say as a light-skinned person, at what age did I notice colorism? I think what's interesting is that I didn't notice it as colorism. I noticed it as like someone being a bad person. So for instance, when I would go visit my family in Grenada, I had a cousin, Michelle, rest in peace, who was dark-skinned. And I won't even say she was dark skinned. She was just darker skinned than me, actually. And she was a brown skinned girl, stay home and mind the baby. And her grandmother was a white woman. Her grandmother was the white sister, half sister to my grandmother, because they both had the same father. And their father was the boss to my great grandmother, Dolly, who was a maid. Putting this together? Okay. Mind you, they all still live in the same village. So my grandmother's sister, Teacher Doreen, she had a daughter named Pam. Pam was also just batshit crazy, but Pam married a brother and they had Michelle. And what I noticed was that her grandparents would be like really mean to her in a way that they weren't mean to me. And I knew that we were both black because I was always aware of my blackness, but I never really understood why they were mean to her. And I didn't understand it as colorism because I didn't even think it was that simple. Like I thought it was maybe that they didn't like her father, or maybe they didn't like, her mom, or, but I didn't assign it to that. And it wasn't until I got older that I started to understand that that's what it was. But I would say that's the first time that I experienced it. I don't know the first time that I experienced colorism and had a consciousness that, oh, this is colorism. And that leads to the next question, because when you ask, do you ever feel guilty when you benefit from it? I think that for a lot of people, there's this thought process that like you're casting for something and like the dark-skinned girl doesn't get picked and you get picked. And it's like, oh, well, they obviously picked me because I'm the light-skinned girl. But I think something that I should clear up is that like, for the most part, like I haven't really seen there being a lot of times where there is like a mixture. I feel like there's been more of a awareness, I would say, lately of like, oh, we want this type of look for this and we want this type of look for this. But for the most part, I think that in the past few years, there has been more of a like, we need someone that represents black and like this very specific vision of what is black, right? And sometimes that for that person is like, she's got an afro, sometimes for that casting person, it's like, oh, like she has braids. And sometimes for that casting person, it's like, oh, it's this light-skinned girl with curly hair. So like, it really ends up being just like what they're asking for that ends up being the what their vision of blackness is, that ends up being the thing. I think it's less what it was before, which was just like, if you're light, you're white and you're right. But in terms of like my feeling guilty, like I really haven't had a lot of experiences where I was in a counterpart situation with somebody. Like for the most part, my stuff has been like as an individual. Like me moving through the world as an individual. Like I'm doing spoken word as an individual. Like I'm singing as an individual. Like I'm hosting as an individual. Like when I got my job hosting on MTV, I don't even know who else interviewed for that job. And I think that's the other thing too, is that a lot of times like you're isolated. So like you're not even aware that that's the case. Now there's other scenarios that I could see somebody in where like, in an academic setting, like everybody is going up for this like tenured position, type of situation, or everybody is, vying for this particular thing. But even in theater, when I was in school, like there wasn't that type of dynamic. So no. And I mean, I know there's going to be people who are watching, they're like, because you're not aware of it. And that's just simply not the case. The reality is that I just never found myself in a scenario where it was like a chorus line or like Top Model, where like we were all lined up and it was like, you go home, you sit down, you go home, that wasn't it. I mean, I can tell you that the last time that I was in that situation was that I can remember, like off the top of my head right now, was when I was 8 auditioning for the Sparkling Christmas Spectacular at Disney. And I don't even know who else I was auditioning with because I was 8. But, in general, do I feel guilty about benefiting from colorism? I mean, no, I don't feel guilty as much as I feel responsible for, doing what I can to undermine white supremacy. I think guilt in that situation is somewhat of an unuseful emotion. It's actually a selfish emotion to feel in that situation because there's nothing action-based around that. And it's not even your fault. Like you were born a certain way into a system that's trash. So the guilt of that to me is not useful as much as the awareness turned into action on how to undermine the perpetuating of it. Next question. How do you handle when someone says you don't look Black enough to comment on Black topics? How do I handle that? It depends on my mood for the day. Sometimes I just block them. I just chuckle and block them. Sometimes I respond with something snarky. Sometimes I'll just ask them like, well, who does look Black enough to comment on topics? Who is Black enough, right? Like, what's your criteria of Blackness? Please, like, lay it out for me. But, internally, my response is always, wow, they still got us in a chokehold. They've still got us in a chokehold. That we as a Black community do not have a unified understanding that our experience and our existence of Blackness in America is unique for the simple fact that we were entrenched in slavery for 400 years is beyond my scope of comprehension. Because what that says is that there are people who feel like if you were raped by a white slave owner and had a child, that child is no longer Black. Even though you have experienced one of the worst side effects of being Black in America as a parent, your child is not Black because these people over here said that now that he has the white blood of a slave owner, he's no longer Black. Like our concept of what we consider Black as an ethnicity has to be different than what Black is considered as a race. Because the racism of Blackness is not about love. The racism of Blackness is not about unity. The racism of Blackness is not about community. So we as Black people cannot be basing Blackness on the same criteria that the white supremacists and oppressive folks are basing our Blackness on. It's just not, it's not practical. It's not feasible for us to unify under. They literally have set up a system of oppression that if we are basing our Blackness within that system of oppression, we are simply just oppressing ourselves. So, when I see, these different folks from different factions undermine someone else's Blackness based on their adjacency to whiteness by nature of skin color or by parentage, that is weird to me. You have a Black parent, you have Black parents, you have light skin. Like we can't just look at someone and be like, you're not Black. Because that's not what Black as an ethnicity should be existing in. And that's where the confusion happens, I think. That's where a lot of the conflict happens around like, well, what is Black? And, that's when people are like, well, why can't Rachel Dolezal be Black? Well, because she's just not, right? She's just not. But when you look at like First Nations, we see that you can have an eighth of a tribe within you and you are still part of that tribe because it's in you. But I think so much of our, so many people in the Black community consider Blackness to be based on factors of struggle, factors of oppression, factors of discrimination. And ultimately, it's like, if that is what defines Blackness, then they won. Which is why I always say every Black experience is a Black experience unless it is anti-Black. Next question. Very confused by so many people in these comments not believing colorism is a real thing. I'd like you to discuss how light-skinned people like to ignore colorism, similar to the ways that white folks ignore racism. Well, one thing I will say, and let me just start off, is that it is, I feel, very offensive when you compare light-skinned Black people's experience or their commentary, et cetera, to white people, because it really tries to suggest that like light-skinned people have the same access to whiteness that white people have, and they don't. The only time a light-skinned person has access to whiteness is if they act as if they are white. Like, they don't get to be a Black person who's light-skinned and have access to whiteness. The two are not interchangeable. You must completely absolve yourself of Blackness and live as a white person. And that means that you are now passing. And if you're passing, that means you've completely disconnected yourself from this ethnicity, this culture, this life. And that's its own trauma in its own way. I think to answer your question about why do so many light-skinned people not think colorism exists, I think what really is happening is that there is a version of colorism that dark-skinned Black folks experience that is far more obvious than the benefit of colorism that light-skinned people experience. And so a lot of light-skinned people are like, and I can tell you, like, I'm like, well, I haven't outwardly had anyone ever say to me, I like you better because you're light skinned, or I chose you because you're light skinned, or you're the best choice because you're light skinned. Never. Whereas there are dark skinned people who can 1000% tell you, I have been told you're ugly because you're dark skinned. I've been told you're less valuable because you're dark skinned. I've been told this because you're dark skinned. You understand what I'm saying? So there is a very obvious, clear example of colorism that many dark-skinned people have experienced that many light-skinned people have not either witnessed or that have not experienced themselves. And so I don't think they're saying that colorism doesn't exist, but I think what they're saying is that the version of privilege that many folks assign to light-skinned Black folks, they don't feel like they have experienced. And you know, I will say this. I think there's something to be said for always remembering that white supremacy has a way of being very surreptitious. Sometimes it's very outward and very conspicuous, but sometimes it's very inconspicuous. And that's why, like, it does have to be a heightened alertness, right? And there just has to be a heightened consciousness about how you challenge things and how you address things. I also think that there's a certain grace that we don't give each other as Black women around that. And I think that there is an ignorance that some light-skinned women have around that, and there's a lack of curiosity around it that they have that they definitely need to be more conscious of and more aware of. I also think that there's an undermining of light-skinned Black women's experiences, and there's a disbelief of light-skinned Black women's experiences that often gets attributed to something that is disregard versus a experience. So what I'm saying is that, like, there's, I think for a lot of people, this idea that, like, well, if you're a light-skinned person that says that you didn't experience colorism, then you're full of it, and you're full of it because you don't care about dark-skinned women. And I think that's the road that we end up going down, that causes the fissure and the chasm between all of us. When in our best selves, we would be as curious as we are judgmental. We got to take out the judge and be curious. And I think one of the biggest issues is that a lot of dark-skinned Black women don't see light-skinned Black women as their sisters. So they see them as adversaries. So when they tell their experience, even if they're asked it, it's seen as not another Black woman telling her experience, but more so a light-skinned Black woman denying a dark-skinned Black woman's experience. And I don't think that's the case every time. It might be the case sometime, but it's never been the case with me. And I know it's not the case with a lot of light-skinned women, as well as I know there's a lot of dark-skinned women who are absolutely like, nah, you don't experience privilege. I've experienced that. I've had dark-skinned women mad at me for saying I have light-skinned privilege. Because they're like, why are you even saying that there's anything better about being light-skinned? I'm like, I'm not saying that there's anything better about being light-skinned. What I'm saying, though, is that by proximity to whiteness, that's what colorism is. And they're like, you're trying to make it out like light-skinned women are better or light-skinned women have it better, but you're not any better. So sometimes I think you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. But that's why we have to have these conversations. Next question. I'm light-skinned, born of 2 light-skinned parents, and it bothers me to be lumped into one category with mixed race people with a non-Black parent, especially when discussing the privileges of being able to pass when I obviously can't. How do y'all feel about being light-skinned versus biracial and some people's unwillingness to acknowledge the difference? I mean, I just think it's a matter of people just wanting to exercise cognitive dissonance. The truth is right in front of you. Like, there's just factual based evidence that 2 dark-skinned Black people can make a light-skinned kid. 2 brown-skinned Black people can make a light-skinned kid. A white woman and a dark-skinned Black man can make a white child and then make a dark-skinned Black child. Like, genes and all of this stuff is very mysterious on how the melanin decides to flow. But I think there's something very different in terms of just kind of the realities that, like, you can be a biracial person that's Black and you can be a light-skinned person that has 2 Black parents that's Black. And the difference is simply that you want to be acknowledged for the truth of your actual existence. Like, when I get annoyed when people say, oh, Amanda has a white parent, it's because not only do I not have a white parent, so I just like the truth to be the truth, but 2, I know they're trying to say it to undermine the validity of my existence as a Black person. And I think that's where a lot of folks feel some type of way, is that there's like an undermining, like there's an invalidation that's happening. And that's not fair. It's also just simply erroneous, and it goes along the lines of alternative facts and just idea that you can just make up a reality simply because it fits the opinion that you want to move with. And that's just not the way the world should work. Facts are not opinions. Period. And once you know the facts, it should change your opinion if your opinion was based on an alternative fact. Next question. Why aren't there dark-skinned folk on this episode since we have the most knowledge surrounding this topic? Why would you have the most knowledge surrounding the experience of being light-skinned? If I saw light-skinned folks on an episode titled Side Effects of Being Dark-Skinned, I would be very confused. But this is what I was talking about earlier, which is this idea that as a light-skinned Black woman, I don't have my own experience. And I don't think you understand how degrading that is to suggest. I don't think you understand how unfair it is to suggest that. And I don't think you understand how disconnecting it is between us to suggest that. A dark-skinned Black woman's experience is her own, and it is for nobody to speak to. A light-skinned Black woman's experience is also her own, and her speaking her experience should not undermine the value and merit of your own dark-skinned experience as a woman. And ultimately, until we as Black women can come to understand the uniqueness of our experiences and move beyond struggle Olympics, which is what a lot of us do. Because then you have light-skinned women who are like, well, I struggled too, and I had to go through this as well, so this is me. And it's like, what are we doing? This is not helpful by any means. But I think that was a really disrespectful question. And I don't think that it was well thought out. I also didn't choose these questions, so blame it on Jeremiah. This episode is also called Side Effects of Being Light-Skinned, not Side Effects of Colorism. And those are two different things. Those are absolutely two different things. If we were doing an episode on colorism and we didn't have light-skinned people on the panel, it would be whatever. But if we were doing an episode on being light-skinned and didn't have light-skinned people on the panel, then what are we talking about? So that is the difference. And I think that what I love about Small Doses is that this is a podcast that speaks to people's experiences. And though we use topics and themes to do so, sometimes I think people get caught up in the fact that one person speaking their experience cannot speak for an entire topic and theme, right? So like even me and Mona talking about our light-skinned experience, well, I mean, that doesn't speak for the entire experience of light-skinnedness. It's side effects of being light-skinned. Well, we're two people who are light-skinned, so these are our side effects. And that's really the point of the conversations, is to bring perspective, because perspective gives us the opportunity to find new answers and new solutions and new understandings. And in my opinion, that is what brings us together. Next question. It would be interesting to hear your perspective on the connection between colorism, texturism, and featureism. Ooh, child, this sounds like a dissertation. And how these three oppressive social systems impact darker-skinned Black women particularly. What are some impactful steps, actions light-skinned Black people can take to combat these ills? In what ways have you fought against these isms in your career or personal life? So colorism, texturism, and featureism. So colorism, of course, we're talking about the skin color as it is in respect to whiteness, like not respect, but in proximity to whiteness. Texturism, we're talking about hair texture. So, you know, from the 1A down to the 4C. And then featureism, when we're talking about, you know, features that are more typically considered African features versus more Anglo-Saxon features, right? So when we look at, you know, beautiful broad noses and beautiful full lips and bodies that are shapely, etc. I think, you know, the isms is a doozy, right? Because the isms exist everywhere. So beyond this, you have, you know, classism, you have racism, you have sexism. You know, they're all of these things end up intersectionally affecting a number of folks. But I think in this regard, as you say that, as you put it, I would say that a lot of people feel like the way these things disproportionately affect darker skinned Black women is at the root colorism first. You know, I think that at the root is the colorism first that plants the seed, and then the texturism and the featureism come out of that, because it becomes like, oh, you're even blacker because you wear your hair in this way, or you're even blacker because you have your nose in this, because your nose is this shape, etc. And that then compounds the pervasiveness of white as right. You know, as a light-skinned Black person, I am very conscious of representation. I'm very conscious of making sure that if I'm in a space that's supposed to be like representing Blackness, that I am not the blackest person there, the darkest person there. I'm very conscious in my casting choices when I'm thinking about my own projects, about how I can make sure that there are various versions of Blackness being accounted for and showing up. And that's beyond just texturism and featureism and colorism, but that also goes to, you know, making sure that there are folks represented from the LGBTQIA plus community, you know, making sure there are folks represented from the disabled community, etc. So just trying to have a consciousness, always keeping that consciousness, and always holding others to that consciousness when I can, right? When I have the power to, bringing that to the attention of folks. You know, I think I gave an example when we were doing the episode about how like I was supposed to do like a line with this fashion designer from Russia, and she basically was calling the next line like an honor to Africa or whatever. And she wanted me to be the spokesperson. I was just like, absolutely not. Like, I can only do this if there is a counterpart that is actually from Africa, perhaps a model that is from Africa, since I'm not a model, right? So like maybe I'm like the spot ta-ta, spokesperson, but the face is a dark-skinned Black woman that is actually from the continent. And they were like, well, we don't understand why this is even necessary because, I mean, she's not racist. She's from Russia. Like, we don't even see race. And I'm just like, the fact that you even said we don't even see race to tell you that. And you know what was crazy too? The designer would not get on the phone with me. Like, they kept making me talk to her publicist. And I was like, how the fuck you want me to come and be the spokesperson for your shit when you don't even get on the phone with me? And I remember we were just like on BBM, and she essentially just, they were like, we don't want to do this with you because you're too difficult. And I was like, so be it. But I may be difficult, but you racist motherfuckers. And ultimately you just thought, oh yeah, she's fine. But instead of being educated by what I was telling them, they were perturbed. And that's often the case with folks, right? So that's why you have to use your privilege whenever you can, because you have to be the one that is going to disrupt the space without being the one who the space is being disrupted for, because then you are now tasking folks with being their own saviors or their own heroes or their own fighters. And ultimately, that just shouldn't be the case. I mean, I do think that sometimes there's a very like high expectation for people to have for light-skinned people to have like a heightened awareness of like what they need to do. But I think we also need to remember that people inherently are selfish AF. And so the other thing that I've learned about, particularly in Hollywood, is that like there really isn't a Black sisterhood here in the way that people think there is. And I think what some people may look at as like, oh, you're not advocating for, or you're not in support of, may actually be that, no, that person is a bitch. And so I'm not supporting them because they have a darker skin. I'm not supporting them because they're a bitch. It has nothing to do with their skin color. It has everything to do with their character. Next question. Actually, before I go on to that question, I want to add too, though, that like, I guess there's this idea that because there is colorism, that light-skinned Black women don't deserve any level of protection in the space, that we don't deserve sisterhood in spaces, that we don't, not even that we don't deserve, but that we don't need it. Because basically what that says is like, well, because you have proximity to whiteness, you don't need or deserve closeness with Blackness. And I can speak for many light-skinned Black women in saying that is not true. And even though we don't experience colorism, that ostracism is very damaging and isolating. And ultimately, we are still Black women, and we want to be with our sisters. Now, the ones who ain't on that, fuck them. You understand me? Fuck them. Last question. What conversations need to be had with each other and our children in order to be more supportive of each other, light, medium, and dark, as Black women collectively? Well, one conversation